I guess all I can say is, welcome to a new day in Prince Edward Island.
Islanders responded by granting us a record number of seats, by far the most seats ever won by a Green Party in Canada.
Conservative wave rolling across Canadian provinces has reached the shores of Prince Edward Island. The PCs garnered the most seats in last night's election, making this the fifth straight provincial race to turn blue. Here's a breakdown of the numbers. The PCs took 12 seats, ending 12 years of Liberal rule. 14 seats are needed for a majority, so they'll have a chance to form a minority government. The Greens, as you'll see there, won 8, which means the party could become the official opposition for the first time in Canada. The Liberals finished with 6, and the NDP was shut out. So what does that mean for the national political landscape? Could it lead to a stronger coalition of Conservative governments all against a federal carbon tax? P.E.I. PC leader Dennis King hasn't said whether he'd scrap the tax in his province. So what are his plans? And Dennis King joins us now from Charlottetown. Hi, Mr. King. Thanks so much for being on the show. Really appreciate it, and congratulations.
Thank you very much, Vassy. It's a pleasure to be here.
I want to start off by asking, obviously you're in minority territory. Have you reached out to anyone in the Liberals or the Greens to try and change that situation at all?
We haven't done anything to that regard yet. We've just really been dealing with the changing lifestyle that we're all living here right now, just trying to begin the process to build a new government. Haven't had any conversations with any of the other leaders other than just to say hi and congratulations.
I understand it's still early, as you're saying, but what do you think your intent is? Like, when you think about the next few days and few weeks, what are you thinking about the possibility of, for example, reaching out to them?
Well, look, I think Islanders delivered a mandate last night, and they delivered a mandate that demands that the members of the Legislative Assembly elected last night to work together. So under this parliamentary system, we are going to be given the first chance to make a government, a minority government. We are beginning with that process. We know to get any bill passed or legislation passed, it's going to take cooperation with the other parties. And it's my intent as the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, as the premier-designate of this province, to reach out across the island to work with all of those MLAs to make sure that we do what is right, which is to run this as the business of the people, and that's what we're intending to do.
Do you envision that happening on a sort of case-by-case basis or piece of legislation by piece of legislation basis, or is there a possibility that there could be a more formal arrangement worked out?
Look, I think we would begin just to do this on a case-by-case basis. I don't think there's a great philosophical divide amongst all of the parties down here. So I think issue-by-issue basis is the way to go to begin. I do believe that there's much more that unites us than divides us on many of the issues. When you look across the platforms, there's a lot of similarities on a lot of issues. So I think there's lots for us to work on. And I think Islanders have told us and are demanding us to make sure that we forget about the colors of politics and work on what is most important, and that is the people of Prince Edward Island, and to put them first.
It sounds good, and certainly watching from the outside, watching the debate and even everyone's reaction the day after, it seems like almost an alternate universe in PEI compared to the rest of the country. But I'm wondering realistically, and I take your point in what you're saying, but realistically, do you think it is that easy to work across party lines? Are there not sort of important cleavages between the parties?
Look, I mean, every government's work is hard. Governing is supposed to be hard. And I don't want to leave the impression that I think this is going to be an easy ride for anybody. But I do think that we have to take the mandate of the people. The people of Prince Edward Island had told us, look, we elected members from 3 parties. We didn't give any one party a clear majority. So that means we want you to work together. And we want to forget about the color of politics and who gets the credit for all of these ideas or solutions, and to work together. So it's incumbent upon all of the people elected last night in this legislature to put the people of Prince Edward Island first, to put the work of Prince Edward Island first. Is it going to be easy? Absolutely not. Are there going to be challenges with this government just as there are with every other government? Absolutely. But that's the job. Governing isn't supposed to be easy, and this certainly won't be.
I'm sure the reporting on the election is a little different on the island versus outside of the island in the rest of the country. But there is sort of this perception and reporting being done on the idea of a blue wave, that we're seeing a number of provinces elect Conservative premiers. And we've seen a lot of them in the past coalesce around the idea of rejecting the carbon tax, the federal carbon tax. Where do you stand on that?
Well, look, we're a little bit unique here in Prince Edward Island. If you're a member of the Liberal Party in Prince Edward Island, you're automatically a member of the Federal Party. It's the same with the Green Party. In Prince Edward Island, if you're a member of the Progressive Conservative Party, you need a separate membership to be in the Federal Party. So we're a little bit disjointed in that regard. And I understand why there's this love to see blue dots popping up on the map and how that might work out federally. But we're a little bit unique here in Prince Edward Island. And my position is not to fight an actual carbon tax. In fact, I think as islanders, we are embracing the fact that we need to do a better job in reducing the carbon in our climate. As an island province, we have to be more wary than most. But what we would like to have a conversation with the federal government about is how we can do something on P.E.I. to actually reduce the carbon and not just increase the cost of gasoline. As you might know, Vashi, we don't have an island-wide public transit system here. We don't have trains. Everything that leaves P.E.I. from the farm gate that goes to your plate is moved by truck. Everyone travels to work by car. So we don't have the option not to drive. We feel the tax is punitive for islanders because we don't have that. So we would like to have the conversation to actually help the government reduce carbon. So that's how we come at it a little bit differently.
Let me just dig a little bit deeper on that and make sure that I'm clear, because I think I remember reading in your platform that sort of province-wide transit, public transit, is something that you would be pushing for. Beyond that, though, just so I'm clear on the carbon levy, would you scrap what's in place now?
Well, listen, I think we're going to continue to have a conversation of what's there. I said during the debates that I give the current government credit. What they did, they put in some measures to reduce the burden of the 4.4 cent a litre increase to gasoline, and I thought that was a good idea. What I think is missing in the solution is there's no actual plan to reduce the carbon, and that's what we would like to do. We're leaders and innovators here in Prince Edward Island.
Isn't that tax supposed to incentivize that, though?
Well, I think in theory it does, but I don't think it works here because we don't have the other options. So what we would like to do is to incentivize islanders further. We're innovators. We're leaders on wind energy generation, solar. So what can we do to help us continue to reduce the carbon footprint here in Prince Edward Island? That's the conversation that's lacking here and the one that we would like to have.
With respect, that doesn't answer the specific question. I understand that you're going to that you want to do things in addition that you say will have a bigger impact on reducing carbon, but does that mean that you will get rid of what's currently in place, or you haven't decided?
Look, I think there's a federal mandate of a program and a policy that's in place that we have to honor. So if you're asking me, are we going to join with other provinces and have a legal fight against this, I would say at this point, I would say no. But I would like to, what I would hope we can do is to open up the conversation to talk to Mr. Prime Minister Trudeau and say, we believe in your plan to reduce carbon. Can you let us help you and help us reach that goal? And I think that's what's missing here. We have a broad Canadian solution, but it doesn't actually deliver on Prince Edward Island what it needs to deliver. We want to help them deliver it.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your time today, Mr. King, and a big congratulations again.
Vashi, it's a very, very big honor for me to be on here. Thank you very much.
Last night, Islanders gave the most seats to the PC party. You just heard there from PC leader Dennis King, with the Green Party expected to form the official opposition for the first time in Canada. The incumbent Liberals now sit in third. So how will the Green Party leader use the newfound power, and what could this signal for the fall federal election? Peter Bevan-Baker is P.E.I.'s Green Party leader, and he joins us from Charlottetown. Hi, Mr. Bevan-Baker. Great to see you. Thank you for your time, and congratulations.
Well, thank you so much. Lovely to be with you.
I appreciate it. So your party's performance, I of course want to start off, as I said, by giving you a congratulations there, but your party's performance, there's a bit of a disparity between what we anticipated based on the polls, which did have a negligible sample size, and what ended up happening in the ballot points. It was about 5.6 percentage points worse than it averaged in those 4 polls published during the campaign. Yeah. What do you think accounts for the difference in the support expressed in those polls and what ended up translating to the ballot box?
That's a hard question to answer. You know, traditional voting patterns here on Prince Edward Island have been rock solid in place for 180 years. And the idea of voting for somebody other than a Conservative or Liberal is a very new experience for almost all Islanders. So I think, you know, when people express a preference in polls, that's one thing, but getting into the ballot box and actually putting your X in a particular spot is another level of commitment. And whether that explains the disparity or not, I don't know. But I mean, let's not forget what an enormous boost in our popular vote this was from last time. It's quite an extraordinary thing that we did here.
What happens from here on in? Is there, for example, are you entertaining any kind of formal agreement, for example, with the PCs or with another party?
Well, those discussions, the formal discussions, have not started yet. Dennis King, whom I believe you're speaking to today as well, he and I have met in and out of interviews today, I think 3 times. So, but we have not sat down and started those formal discussions yet. Absolutely, there are so many permutations here, given that we have 3 parties represented in our legislature. So, how that will all play out, I don't know. But clearly, if Dennis wants to get the confidence of the House, he's going to have to enter into some sort of arrangement with either the Liberals or the Greens.
He anticipated that it would be on a more, and again, he hasn't, like you, committed to anything specific, but he anticipates, in our interview, he said that it would happen on a more case-by-case basis, sort of bill by bill, piece of legislation by piece of legislation. Is that your anticipation, or are you also open to something more formal?
I suspect that what Dennis was talking about and what I have in my head are fairly similar things. I don't imagine that we will enter into a formal coalition here. Whether or not we have the sort of agreement that the Greens and NDP do in New Brunswick, that supply and confidence agreement, or just as you just described there, an issue-by-issue informal agreement, I don't know. And I guess that's what the conversation that Dennis and I will have perhaps tomorrow morning. He invited me for a cup of coffee, actually, as we passed just 10 minutes ago.
Oh, so that first discussion we can say here on Power and Politics will occur tomorrow morning? Is that clear?
Well, at least that's what Dennis said, and I don't think we'll be talking about last night's hockey scores. I think it's going to be something a little more profound than that.
Yeah, let's hope not. The poor Leafs.
Yeah, right.
that won't make me
brought that up.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no, rubbing some salt in the wounds there. Let me ask you about some of the priorities that you had. I took a look through your platform over the past few days, and a lot of the conversation outside of the province has focused on the fact that you weren't just focused on a carbon tax or on measures for the environment. In fact, I think it was the third in your list of priorities. You had a big promise for social spending, for example, things along those lines. When it does come to the carbon, your policy on the environment, you were specific about a carbon tax. Mr. King does not have the same proposals. He's not being explicit, for example, about whether he would get rid of what's in existence now. He says he won't fight the feds in court, that type of thing. Is that somewhat of a deal breaker? Like, is that a big deal when you're thinking about supporting them in whatever capacity that ends up working out?
Well, I mean, clearly environmental issues have always been and will remain foundational to what the Green Party is in politics for, but it's not the only thing that we're there for. My issue with the current arrangement that our provincial government has struck with the federal government is that they're rebating 3/4 of the carbon tax on fossil fuels right back to drivers. So it's not creating the effect that it should have. Mr. King has really not been clear about what he would like to see when it comes to dealing with the carbon pricing. But I think there are other ways beyond carbon. I mean, carbon price is an absolutely fundamental tool in the toolbox when it comes to dealing with climate change, but it's not the only thing. And I think there was a great deal of alignment actually between our 2 platforms when it comes to incentives for solar panels, for example, or electric vehicles or charging stations or public transit. All of those other aspects, which, may cost more per ton of carbon reduction, but are all part of the plan. So I'm not going to say that's a deal breaker, but it's certainly something on which we have some fundamental disagreements. Can
I ask you a bit to expand a little bit on when you say that you don't think that rebating it directly to, the consumer or the person driving the car is actually going to have an effect? What do you mean by that? Because the argument from the federal government has been that it will still, regardless of the rebate, it will still incentivize behavior.
Yeah, well, it depends on what you do with the money. I mean, the carbon tax is not a revenue. It's not there to collect revenue. It's there to change behavior. And by increasing the price of fossil fuels, the plan of a carbon tax is to incentivize you to do other things. So if you give that money back to individuals through a dividend or a rebate and allow them to make those choices, then you can have both the benefit of nudging behavior towards cleaner technologies, plus the market-driven allowing people to make their own choices. Here, what they've done is they took 3 of the 4 cents that we added to carbon tax on fossil fuels and rebated it back on carbon tax fossil fuel, on the fossil fuels themselves. It's sort of, it as one economist here on the island put it, it's gratuitously stupid. It's not providing the incentive, and it's not using the money in a way that we could use it. So I think the plan we have here is wholly insufficient, and we put forward our own carbon pricing plan, which I actually haven't heard from Mr. King whether he feels it's a better, an improvement on the Liberal one or not.
Is that a big sort of make or break item for you, though, when you look towards potentially working with the PCs?
Well, there's a couple of things about that. You know, we may have a new federal parliament come October, a federal government. And who knows whether the successor will continue with the same plan that our provincial government is working with. And here we have a 2-year agreement which has been secured between the provincial government and the federal government. So there's a sort of a hard timeline on that as well. So whether or not those two things which could interfere or, you know, play a role in this would make this a deal breaker, I'm really not sure about that, Vashi.
Okay, I appreciate your time today, Mr. Bevan-Baker. Congratulations once again. Thank you.
My pleasure. Nice chatting with you.
P.E.I. made history last night by electing a minority government for the first time and giving the Green Party its best showing ever with a second-place finish. Polls leading up to the vote were pointing in a slightly different direction, with talk of the country's first Green government. So did the polls miss the mark? CBC Polls analyst Eric Grenier joined me to dig into last night's results. Let's go through those results first, and then we'll talk about the polls.
Yeah, that's right. So it is a minority government, the first in P.E.I.'s history. And if we look at those numbers in terms of the seat count for each of the parties, the PCs did emerge with the most seats at 12. The Greens have 8, the Liberals have 6. There's one more seat that needs to be decided after the death of Josh Underhay, so there'll be a by-election within the next 3 months, but it won't change that this is a minority legislature. And if we look at the popular vote, this is what was interesting compared to where the polls were. You can see that the PCs had just over 36% of the vote, the Greens just under 31%, the Liberals are at 29.5%, and the NDP was at 3%. So a big result for the Greens, the best they'd ever done in any election anywhere in the country had been in BC in 2017. It took 17% of the vote, so they've almost doubled that, and they elected 8 MLAs. There are 8 other Greens in the rest of the country combined. So it shows just how much of a breakthrough it was for the party.
So you had cautioned in the lead up to the election that the polls were based on small sample size and were not, and you weren't the only one. There were a lot of people saying it's really hard to say concretely if this level of popular support expressed in the polls will directly translate to seats. What ended up happening?
Yeah, the polls we saw about a week before were putting the Greens somewhere between 35-40%, which would have been enough for at least a minority, maybe even a majority if they had gotten close to that 40%. There was one poll that was done just at the last minute. It was released, Forum Research. It had the PCs ahead by 1 point. So it's starting to show that maybe the PCs had some late momentum. But I think what the difference, especially in a province like P.E.I. might have been, was that the Greens don't have the same resources as the PCs and the Liberals. They don't have the same get-out-the-vote operation. And the Greens only had 2 incumbents, whereas the Liberals had a number of them. The PCs had 8 incumbents that were re-elected. And in a province like P.E.I., the local candidate probably matters more than in any other province. So the fact that the Greens didn't have as many of those incumbents probably would have made it a bit harder for them to win some of those seats. The fact that they weren't able to get their vote out maybe had an impact as well. But this is a problem that the Greens have had everywhere. 9 out of 10 elections, the Greens do not match their polling numbers. They come out underneath it. So I think this is one of the problems that the Greens have to tackle ahead of the federal election, is how to turn these good poll numbers into actual votes. Still, historic result, 31%, best the Greens have ever done. It could have been a bit better.
We have Peter Bevan-Baker a little bit later on the show. We did the interview earlier this afternoon, and I asked him about that, and he said sort of that people are still used to voting for the traditional options, and so while they may express a sentiment in a poll, when they get into the ballot box, it's a bit of a different situation, and that manifests, I guess, elsewhere as well. Let's talk about the federal implications, if there are some, because there was a lot of focus on this given the potential prospects for the Greens. From where you sit, what are the implications nationally?
If we start with where the Conservatives are, like I've seen in the interview with Dennis King, talking about those blue spots. When you're looking at these results, the PCs actually dropped a little bit of the vote compared to where they were in 2015. So it isn't that there was a wave of support towards the PCs that elected them. It was almost that the Liberals had dropped back, a lot of that vote going to the Greens that helped elect a lot of PC MLAs. And also when you see the the way he was speaking, he's certainly not going to be another Jason Kenney or Doug Ford around the Premier's table. So we'll have to wait and see.
At least not on the issue of the carbon tax.
At least on that. So we'll have to wait and see how that kind of plays out. But for the Greens, I think it does have an impact because exactly what you just said, that a lot of voters might have been reticent to cast a ballot for the Greens because in the past it has been a quote-unquote wasted vote. Whereas now in the federal election in the fall, Elizabeth May will be able to go around the country and say, you've elected Green MLAs, you've elected Green MPPs, a vote wasn't wasted when you cast it for the Green Party, so you can actually vote in and elect a Green candidate. And I think that's why the Greens will probably be wanting to focus on a lot of these ridings where voters are starting to get a bit more used to voting for the Green Party. I don't think they'll be targeting seats that haven't had a lot of success at the provincial or federal levels. But this could be a bit of a blueprint for them to focus on these kinds of ridings and also take the approach that we saw with Peter Bevan-Baker of not being, putting the focus on how the Green Party is just a party that does things differently. Because I think there is an appetite for that among voters. So it could give them an opportunity, particularly if the election is looking to be as ugly and dirty as it could be between Andrew Scheer and Justin Trudeau.
And what about, before I let you go, electoral reform? Because there was a referendum attached to this this vote as well, and I understand that the margin was very narrow against it, and there was a certain threshold that had to be met in order for it to be binding. What happens now?
Yeah, there were two thresholds: one 50%, and also that it had to be in I think it was 16 or 17 districts across the island, and it came up short. It did win in the majority of ridings, ironically enough, that first past proportional representation would have won this referendum if it had been a first past the post referendum, but it wasn't. They also lost on the popular vote. This has to be one of the last nails in the coffin for this, I think, on this issue. And we've seen actually some people are starting to say that Peter Bevan-Baker today also said maybe the conversation has to, that's it for now, because it's been BC where it came up short in the recent referendum. In this case where it failed again. So I think that this might be the last we might hear about it for a little while. We'll see if someone wants to give another shot, but there just hasn't been a lot of chances. When it's been put to voters, do you want to change the electoral system? They just haven't been able to get it high enough that a change has actually happened. So another defeat for that movement. We'll see if it pops up again somewhere else.
All right, thank you, Eric. Appreciate it. The CBC's polls analyst, Eric Grenier. What does the election outcome in P.E.I. indicate about what voters want? And are any of the federal parties paying attention to the signals Canadians are sending? It's time for the Power Panel. In Calgary, Marcella Monroe of KTG Public Affairs. Amanda Alvaro of Pomp and Circumstance joins us from Toronto. And here with me in studio, Summa Strategies' Tim Powers and host of CBC Radio's The House, Chris Hall. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Nice to see you. Chris, I have to start with you. As we were discussing in the break, you apparently spent some time in P.E.I.
Oh, that was 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, that's more time than most of us have spent, I think. Well, I'm sorry, Tim excluded. Tell us your thoughts on the outcome of the election and what implications, if any, do you think there are on a wider scale?
Okay, the big picture is that it's yet another provincial government that has changed hands, another Liberal premier who's gone down to defeat, although Rachel Notley in Alberta would be the exception to that rule. So voters are clearly embracing change at the provincial level. So if you're the federal government, the federal parties, you want to take account of that. So what is it that's working? What is fueling this desire for change? That's the first thing. Secondly, the Greens, they became the balance of power in British Columbia 2 years ago. They won 3 seats in New Brunswick. Now they've got 8 seats in P.E.I. Clearly, not only is change embracing in terms of the change of government, but people are prepared, it seems anyway, at the provincial level, to look at a non-traditional party, to listen to what they have to say. And if you looked at the Green platform in P.E.I., it was very straightforward. It wasn't just on the environment. It was about poverty. It was about a guaranteed income. It had a future vision down at 25 years down the road. So as we look ahead to the federal election campaign, especially this by-election coming up in May 6th in the Nanaimo Ladysmith, if you're the Greens, you're going to be galvanized. And if you're other parties, you have to worry about what kind of vote splitting might happen and what message voters themselves are taking as they look ahead to the fall.
Atlantic Canada, we're a nicer, gentler breed. That's what you saw. That's what you saw in Premier King or Premier-designate King. And apparently, Premier-designate King rents his barn to my cousin, so that's going to just add to the fact that we're all cozy.
Full disclosure.
Full disclosure. Yeah, that's my bias. Though I know Premier McLaughlin, fine fellow. 3 quick points. I think there is a little bit of different disruption happening in Atlantic Canada. We saw it in New Brunswick, where there were 3 Green seats, and also the People's Alliance Party came forward. Atlantic Canada does things at a different sort of pace in terms of its disruption. It's supported and has supported the federal Liberals for a very long time, even in the worst years. 2011 election, it was the region where the federal Liberals did the most. I think there's still, as it relates to the federal party, a strong tendency to vote Liberal. I don't think the region is going to switch to blue or green or orange, but I do think they're going to lose seats. And I think the third lesson from all of this is to understand the different bits of disruption that are happening in the country. In Atlantic Canada, the affordability issue is sort of flipped around in a different way. It's about seniors and affordability. That's why Bevan-Baker's platform was well regarded, because housing prices for the first time in P.E.I. are shooting up because there's a lot of new immigrants coming, and that's a very good thing. Healthcare costs are going up, as is standard care, though they are publicly funded, but it's getting harder for seniors to get by. And with an aging region and an aging populace, they're ironically experiencing some of the things millennials are in Toronto and Vancouver, but from a different side of the age clock.
So what are the implications, do you think, Amanda? I mean, P.E.I. is a small province, but the outcome, in Atlantic Canada more generally too. What do you think the implications are for federal parties who are watching this?
Well, I think you can see it in that short clip that you had of Premier-designate King when he talks about, like, this wasn't just, an election of one party. This was the people telling us that we all have to work together. And if you contrast that to recent elections across the country, the tone couldn't be more different. So we talk a lot about sort of this blue wave and the turnover of governments, provincial governments across the country. But I think in this case, some of the things that became really important in this election, and some of the things that he talked about as a conservative, were education and teachers and teaching assistants, and that's not the tone or the policies that we're hearing elsewhere in the country. So the values, I think, are very different, and I don't think they quite represent what the Conservative Party has put out either federally or some of the big elections in Ontario and Alberta, like we saw with Kenny and Ford. I also think, though, that these are interesting times, obviously, for the Green Party, and I think that there's this buoys the Green Party, and this provides some momentum. But I'm sure Eric talked about it when he spoke to you in the last segment, talked about how important that organization, that ground game is. And I'm sure that the Green Party federally is looking at that and saying, like, watching the polls and all of this, the hope that went into this may have been the first Green government, and then knowing that really at the end of the day, it probably came down to a lot about local candidates and how important they are, and certainly about how important it is to be able to get out the vote, how important those resources are in the ground game. So I would imagine that they would be trumping some of that up as we head into the federal election.
Do you think, Marcella, it is, do you think Amanda has a point there on Conservatives not being able to sort of claim this as a victory of their own? And I ask because he was actually, when we interviewed Mr. King, he was kind of specific about saying that his party doesn't have automatic, like if you're in the provincial party, you don't have automatic federal membership. But then a lot of what he talked about was congruent with what we hear from federal Conservatives, concern about the way in which, for example, a carbon tax is applied and the extra cost and affordability. He wasn't against it the way that we've heard rhetoric from other premiers, but he had similar concerns. What is this sort of a victory for the Conservative movement?
I don't think so, not in the way that we've seen in Ontario or Alberta. I mean, I think we can all see, as everyone's kind of referred to, this was definitely a kinder, gentler version of Canadian politics, kind of harkened back to my good old days in university and watching how polite and thoughtful people were during that campaign. I think it might be organizationally part of the quote unquote national conservative machine that helped out there, but I think we're all in agreement here. It was a very different kind of campaign, very much more door-to-door grassrootsy. I mean, you saw all three political parties just naturally stopped their campaigning when that poor young candidate, who I'm sorry, whose name escaped me, died so tragically with his son. And that wasn't even, that didn't need to be debated for 2 days. There was no challenge from one party to a leader to another. It was just, you need to stop this, right? I am
Josh Underhay was his name, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you very much. I think if we're going to take anything from this, I think us political operatives in other parts of the country for the national campaign, it's maybe we can take a page out of the polite book and try to have a bit more of a respectful discussion. I'm also very interested, I think the other thing to notice about the tone of Mr. King's interview. It wasn't just that there's that folksy P.E.I. charm, and I was born there, weirdly, which is a whole other long story. It was.
I got a barn you can rent.
Awesome. But it was that, I think he understands, unlike some people who have been writing about it today, he hasn't won anything yet. He's won a plurality of seats in the legislature. He's now got to, go ask to try and set up the government, and then he's got to negotiate. And as we saw in BC, a negotiation of this sort can lead to a lot of different outcomes. So I think we still don't really know, and so I'd be as conciliatory as he was, even more so.
Two quick things. I don't think that we can add Dennis King to the Resistance magazine cover of Brian Pallister and Doug Ford and Jason Kenney and Andrew Scheer. That's the first thing. I do think there is a lesson, though, that people shouldn't forget out of this election campaign with respect to the Greens. If you look at the Greens federally, they got 3.5% of the popular vote in 2015, but they did double digits in the 20%, and in Elizabeth May's case, 54% of the vote in the seat she won, in very interesting areas. One of them is around Nanaimo, Ladysmith, and in Vancouver Island, where I think the Greens could be able to build on what we saw from Prince Edward Island. They did well in Guelph, which is the seat of the Green Party leader Mike Schreiner in Ontario. Yeah. They did well in Fredericton, which is the seat of David Kuhn, who's a Green Party leader. So there are pockets, and if they channel their energies into those specific ridings where they did 20%, 15% in 2015, they may vote split to allow a party like the Conservatives to come up the middle because they're going to draw disproportionately from Liberals and the NDP, or they may win a couple of seats as a result of this. So the calculations have to be a bit different than what we've seen, despite how nice this campaign was, but what we've seen from Prince Edward Island.
Yeah, a quick couple of other regional things. Ironically, the PC party in P.E.I. has had a little bit of a closer link with the federal party in Canada, even when Stephen Harper was there. Gail Shea, for example, who was the federal fisheries minister, had been a provincial PC member. New Brunswick PCs have always been generally fairly well aligned with the federal party, but there's a message there for incumbents, and the incumbents federally are the Liberals too, and that message is there is this mood of discontent and disquiet there. Ignore it at your peril. So it's easy to say, yes, they may not align comfortably with Andrew Scheer, but they're also not comfortable right now with the established order. I can't think of the last time, maybe Chris can, when we've had two minority governments in Atlantic Canada at the same time. It's a really odd thing. They haven't had a minority government in P.E.I. since the 1800s. Not even Chris was born then. That's a long time ago.
Mr. McLaughlin lost his seat.
Yeah.